sitting here getting reacquainted with Dan Blocker, and of course you know him as Haas on Bonanza.
The weapon is research, and the enemy is cancer.
Do you have much trouble separating Dan Blocker from Horst Cartwright?
Well, not anymore.
To millions of Bonanza fans, Dan Blocker was the lovable, gentle giant. The kind-hearted soul who brought warmth, humor, and innocence into American homes every Sunday night. The man who made you smile just by showing up on screen. But what if that wasn't the full story? What if behind that soft smile was a man shaped by war, haunted by violence, and quietly battling demons that never made it to the screen? Because decades after his sudden death, a long-whispered truth has finally been confirmed by someone who knew him best, his own son. A truth that changes everything we thought we knew about the man behind Horst Cartwright. This isn't just the story of a beloved TV star. It's the story of a soldier, a fighter, and a father whose real legacy has only now come to light. Dan Blocker didn't just arrive in the world, he made an entrance. Born in a small Texas town in 1928, he weighed a staggering 14 pounds at birth. Doctors were stunned. His mother was in shock. And the townspeople? They were already talking. From the very beginning, Dan was larger than life, literally. Growing up in O'Donnell, Texas, his size set him apart, but it was his heart that made him stand out. As a child, he spent long hours working at his family's grocery store, carrying bags for customers, sweeping the floors, doing whatever needed to be done. He wasn't just big, he was dependable, quiet, gentle. By age 10, he was already doing the work of grown men, hauling grain, lifting crates, and swinging hammers on construction sites. The locals started calling him the Big Un, not just because of his size, but because of the way he moved through the world. With strength, with kindness, and without a hint of arrogance. At 12 years old, Dan had already hit 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. Some kids tried to pick fights just to see what he'd do. They didn't try twice. Dan never started trouble, but he never backed down from it either. But what really shaped him wasn't just the physical work, it was the small-town values. Respect your elders, keep your word, look out for the little guy. Those weren't just sayings in Dan's world, they were the code he lived by. And long before he'd ever stand in front of a camera, that quiet code would shape every decision he made, from the battlefield to the biggest stages in Hollywood. Before Hollywood ever called his name, Dan Blocker wore a different kind of uniform. After college, at the height of the Korean War, he joined the US Army. Not as an actor, not as a celebrity. Just another young man willing to risk his life for his country. But even in war, Dan stood out. At over 6 feet 3 inches and nearly 300 pounds, he was a giant among soldiers. It took weeks just to find boots that would fit him. His presence alone could intimidate, but it wasn't his size that earned respect on the battlefield. It was his courage. Stationed near Chorwon, North Korea, Dan served as a combat infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment. The fighting was brutal. Freezing temperatures, sleepless nights, shellfire that never seemed to stop. And yet, Dan didn't flinch. One night, during an intense battle, a fellow soldier was pinned down under heavy fire. Without thinking twice, Dan charged into the chaos. Bullets flew past him. The air shook with explosions. But he reached his comrade, pulled him to safety, and took the hit himself. The injury left a mark, but it also earned him a Purple Heart. Still, Dan never boasted, never used the medal for attention. He wore it with quiet pride and never spoke much about what he saw. But something changed in him out there. The brutality of war, the senseless loss, the noise, the blood. It stayed with him. And when he came home, he didn't leave those memories behind. He carried them into every chapter of his life. The experience didn't harden him, it deepened him. And that deep compassion, that fierce loyalty, would soon become the heart of the character that would make him famous. Dan Blocker never planned on becoming an actor. In fact, the idea seemed almost laughable to him at first. After returning from war, he enrolled at Seoul Ross State University on a football scholarship. With his massive frame and athletic ability, The future seemed destined to play out on the field, not on a stage. But fate had other plans. One day, the college drama department needed help moving heavy stage props. And who better to call than the biggest guy on campus? Dan agreed, thinking it would be a quick favor. Nothing more. But then, he caught a glimpse of something else. The energy, the storytelling, the way people transformed under the stage lights. And something clicked. Soon, he wasn't just lifting props, he was stepping into roles. His first part was in a college production of Arsenic and Old Lace. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't big, but it was enough to light a fire. Dan changed his major from English to theater, turned down offers to play professional football, packed his bags, and moved to New York City, not to chase fame, but to chase a feeling. That same spark he'd felt on stage. He studied Shakespeare, auditioned constantly, took any role he could find, and slowly, the mountain of a man from Texas started turning heads. His big break came in the late 1950s when TV westerns were dominating American screens. Casting directors were always searching for rugged, authentic men who could look the part. Dan didn't just look it, he lived it. With bit parts in Gunsmoke, Maverick, and Have Gun, Will Travel, he started building momentum. The audience loved his mix of raw strength and gentle humor. Hollywood was beginning to pay attention, but he hadn't seen anything yet. Because the role that would define his life, the role of Hoss Cartwright, was just around the corner. The moment Dan Blocker stepped into the role of Hoss Cartwright, something clicked. Not just for him, but for millions of Americans. Bonanza wasn't just another TV Western. It was the first network show to air in color, and it quickly became one of the most watched programs in the country. Viewers tuned in week after week to watch the Cartwright family navigate life on the Ponderosa Ranch. But it was Hoss, the gentle, kind-hearted middle son, who became the soul of the show. Unlike the rugged, brooding cowboys of most westerns, Hoss was different. He wasn't fast with a gun or quick with sarcasm. He was warm, loyal, honest to a fault. And beneath the jokes and simple wisdom was a character with surprising emotional depth. Dan Blocker didn't play Hoss. He was Hoss. He brought to the role his own quiet sense of justice, shaped by war and hardship. He gave Hoss a kind of moral clarity, a belief in fairness, in helping others, in protecting the underdog. It was more than a performance. It was a reflection of who he really was. Off-screen, Dan was just as beloved by the cast and crew. He formed deep friendships with co-stars Lorne Greene and Michael Landon. The chemistry you saw on screen? That was real. They laughed together, supported each other, and leaned on one another during life's tough moments. Dan even served as best man at Landon's wedding. For Dan, Hoss wasn't just a career-defining role. It was a responsibility. He once said he modeled Hoss after the Quaker philosophy, "Do all the good you can." And week after week, that's what he did. He made people feel safe, he made them laugh, and he reminded them that strength wasn't always about fists or firepower. Sometimes it came from a big heart. But the spotlight came with a price, and Dan Blocker was about to learn just how heavy that fame could become. Dan Blocker didn't just play a man of principle on TV, he lived it. Behind the scenes, the man who portrayed Hoss Cartwright was known for something even bigger than his size, his quiet but unshakable sense of right and wrong. That commitment was put to the test during a location shoot for Bonanza in the American South. The cast and crew had arrived at a hotel after a long day of filming, exhausted and ready to rest, only to be told that the hotel would not accommodate one of their African-American team members. The staff tried to explain. "Policy," they said. "Local rules." But Dan Blocker wasn't interested in excuses. He made it clear, if one member of the crew couldn't stay, none of them would. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make a scene, but his message was immovable. They packed up and left, together. It wasn't a grand gesture for the cameras. There were no reporters, no headlines, just a man refusing to be part of something he knew was wrong. And that wasn't a one-off moment. Dan was deeply disturbed by injustice in all its forms. In interviews, he spoke out against bullies, discrimination, and especially war. Having seen firsthand the destruction of the Korean battlefield, he became a vocal critic of military violence, particularly America's use of napalm in Vietnam. While other celebrities stayed silent, Dan used his voice. But he never did it for attention. He never turned his beliefs into a brand. He simply stood up when something felt wrong. His strength wasn't just physical, it was moral. And while millions loved him for playing Hoss, those who knew him personally loved him for something far more powerful. He was the kind of man who did the right thing, even when no one was watching. By the early 1970s, Dan Blocker was one of the most recognizable faces on television. Everywhere he went, people called out to him, not by his real name, but as Hoss. Airports, restaurants, gas stations. Even when he tried to take his kids on vacation, strangers would gather just to catch a glimpse. At first, it was flattering, but over time, it became something else. Heavy, exhausting. Dan had never chased fame. He loved acting, not attention. And the constant spotlight began to wear on him. So, he made a decision few in his position would ever consider. He walked away. In 1970, Dan and his wife Dulthea packed up their family and moved to the peaceful lakesides of Switzerland. No paparazzi, no fan mobs, just quiet mornings, mountain air, and time, real time, with his children. Some tabloids speculated he was in financial trouble, but Dan quickly shut that down. Bonanza had made him wealthy. The move wasn't about money, it was about peace. And in Switzerland, he found it. Bonanza aired overseas too, but in German. So for the first time in years, Dan could walk down a street without being stopped. He could sit at a cafe, read a book, watch his kids grow up. He even joked about returning to teaching, something he had loved long before Hollywood ever came calling. But beneath the stillness, there was a quiet reality. Fame had never felt natural to him. He didn't crave awards or limelight. What he valued was depth, family, justice, integrity. And while he continued to fly back to the US for Bonanza shoots, his heart stayed in the Alps, far away from the flashing cameras. Dan Blocker had built a life millions admired on screen. But in Switzerland, he finally built a life that felt like his own. By 1972, Dan Blocker had found balance, or so it seemed. He split his time between filming Bonanza in the US and enjoying a quiet, grounded life with his family in Switzerland. His kids were thriving, his marriage was strong, and the chaos of fame finally felt manageable. But that peace was about to be shattered. Dan had been dealing with gallstones, a common condition, nothing alarming. Doctors recommended a routine surgery to remove his gallbladder. Simple, standard, low risk. He went in for the procedure in Los Angeles. Everything appeared to go smoothly. There were no immediate complications, and those closest to him breathed a sigh of relief. Friends expected him back on set within weeks. But just days later, everything changed. Without warning, Dan suffered a sudden pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to his lungs. It struck fast, silently, fatally. At just 43 years old, Dan Blocker was gone. The news hit like a thunderclap. Cast members were devastated. Fans around the world were stunned. Hollywood mourned, not just the loss of a beloved actor, but the loss of a man whose presence had made Bonanza feel like home. His co-stars didn't just lose a colleague, they lost a brother. Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, was so shaken he took it upon himself to write the first episode following Dan's death. But instead of scripting a dramatic farewell, he let the silence speak. Hoss's absence was never explained, just felt. It was a subtle, haunting tribute. And it gave the audience space to grieve alongside the Cartwright family. Behind the scenes, the weight of Dan's loss lingered in every scene, every empty chair on set. The heart of the show was missing, and everyone knew it. But outside of Hollywood, a strange rumor began to spread, one that would fuel legends for years to come. In the days and weeks after Dan Blocker's sudden death, tributes poured in from around the world. Fans sent letters, newspapers ran heartfelt memorials, and on television, the void he left behind was undeniable. But amid the sorrow, a strange rumor began to circulate. Whispers started in fan circles, then in small-town papers, and eventually found their way into popular culture. The claim? That Dan Blocker was so large, so physically imposing, that when he died, a standard casket wouldn't do. They said he was buried in a piano box. The stories spread fast. For some, it felt oddly fitting, a larger-than-life man needing a larger-than-life send-off. It sounded dramatic, almost poetic, and in a strange way, comforting, like something out of a tall tale. But the truth was far simpler, and far more human. Dan Blocker was laid to rest in a traditional casket at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, California. No piano box, no oversized crate, just a peaceful, dignified burial for a man who had lived with quiet grace. Still, the myth refused to die. It popped up in biographies, fan forums, even in interviews with people who should have known better. It became part of his legend, one final exaggeration to match the mountain-sized presence he had in people's lives. And maybe that's the most telling part of all. Dan had touched so many people, meant so much to so many, that the line between truth and legend blurred. People didn't want to believe he was gone. They wanted a story, something big enough to match the man himself. In the end, the piano box myth wasn't about measurements. It was about memory. And Dan Blocker, in life and in death, had become unforgettable. For years after Dan Blocker's death, his family stayed largely silent. They grieved in private, protected his legacy. Let the world remember Hoss Cartwright the way they wanted to. But behind the silence was a young boy who had lost not just a father, but a giant of a presence in his life. Dirk Blocker was only a teenager when his dad died suddenly. One moment, Dan was cracking jokes in the kitchen. The next, he was gone. No goodbye, no warning. The trauma was life-altering. Dirk, like his father, pursued acting, but he didn't want the spotlight. Fame had taken too much. He opted instead for quieter roles, staying out of the headlines, working steadily without chasing celebrity. Years later, as an adult, Dirk began to open up, and what he revealed painted a fuller, richer portrait of the man millions only knew as Hoss. Dan wasn't just a beloved TV star. He was a deeply principled man, a war veteran haunted by what he'd seen, a father who prioritized time with his kids over flashy premieres, a man who read philosophy, questioned power, and stood up for what was right, even when no one was watching. In interviews, Dirk confirmed what many fans had long suspected. His father struggled with the pressure of fame. The attention made him uncomfortable, the lack of privacy wore him down, and the sudden shift from humble schoolteacher to household name had taken its toll. But despite it all, Dan Blocker never let the industry change him. He remained the same soft-spoken man who once hauled grain in Texas, fought through trench warfare in Korea, and stood up against racism on a film set. To Dirk, his father's real legacy wasn't Hoss Cartwright. It was the example he set as a human being. Strong, honest, kind, and utterly, quietly unforgettable. Dan Blocker's story isn't just about a character on a TV screen. It's about the man behind the cowboy hat, the war hero, the quiet activist, the protective father, and the reluctant star who never let fame define him. He lived big, but not loud. He stood tall, but never over others. And he fought, only when something was worth fighting for. In a world that often rewards flash over substance, Dan Blocker chose heart over headlines. He chose family over fame. And he chose integrity, even when no one was watching. For years, audiences knew him as Hoss Cartwright, the lovable middle son with a booming laugh and a tender soul. But now, thanks to the words of his son, we've been given something even more powerful. The truth. The truth that heroes don't always ride in with guns blazing. Sometimes they walk softly. Sometimes they carry scars no one sees. And sometimes they leave behind a legacy so honest, so quietly meaningful, that it outlasts every show, every rumor, every myth. Dan Blocker was one of those rare people. And now, we finally see the whole man. Not just the one on screen, but the one who lived with grace and left us too soon.